The RAS is like our brain's filter. Think of this as our own real-life social media algorithm. What you pay attention to, you see more of. Okay, so now I get to talk about SESH Intention. We developed this to be used as a tool to encourage positive thinking. It's thought that we have about 60,000 thoughts every single day. And we know these thoughts influence our epigenetics and the synthesis of proteins that result from that. Examples are when we have happy, exciting thoughts, our bodies produce and secrete serotonin, dopamine. On the other hand, if we have thoughts that are upsetting to us or sad, we're gonna produce cortisol. So this gives us 60,000 opportunities every day to shift our body into a healing and anti-inflammatory state. As Bob Proctor said in the documentary The Secret, thoughts become things, and that's absolutely true. The question is, well, how does positive thinking work to benefit our health? That happens because positive thoughts help train an area of our brain called the Reticular Activating System, or the RAS. And the RAS is like our brain's filter. And that's because everything, whether good or bad, is happening all around us all the time. And it's too much for our brains to comprehend and process. The RAS filters out what it thinks is not important or it should ignore, and pays attention to the things that it feels that is important to us. So think of this as our own real-life social media algorithm. What you pay attention to, you see more of. Positive thoughts help us look for those healing opportunities. So things that make us feel happy, things that give us a sense of gratitude, etc. So the more we pay attention to these, the more we see, and that has a material benefit to our physical health. I hope people are using SESH for this, but admittedly, you can use any other scent to create a healing ritual around positive thinking. However, where SESH differs from any other scent in the world is that SESH is the only one that targets the endocannabinoid system, and it's the only scent that's developed to tweak the endocannabinoid system. The benefit to that is the ECS is critical for a phenomenon known as the placebo effect. The placebo effect is a phenomenon where our thoughts and beliefs about a particular outcome brings about that outcome. And this is such a powerful phenomenon that even the conventional medical community and the research communities, you control for this in human clinical trials. So you've heard the term randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled clinical trial. And that is considered the gold standard when it comes to research. And that illustrates to you the power of the mind and our intentions. Now, what's really cool is that research has also shown in body-mind medicine studies that a dysfunctional endocannabinoid system results in a poor placebo response. So if we can tweak the function of our endocannabinoid system and keep it healthy, we should be able to leverage better the powerful effect of the placebo effect. Now, SESH was developed to use specific terpenes and essential oils that help tune the ECS so that it can receive the full benefits of the placebo effect. And what we're trying to do with this is we're really trying to change a narrative around the placebo effect. Often we see that the medical community has spun the placebo effect from a negative perspective. So you often hear things like, oh, that was no better than the placebo, when in fact, we should really emphasize the positive attributes of the placebo effect. So it's just changing the wording to, that was as good as the placebo effect. And by doing this, we can absolutely change our physical health by our thoughts and beliefs. When should you use SESH? Well, whether it's a spray or the aromatherapy drops, use SESH freely before any healing ritual. So things like meditation, yoga, prayer, a clearing session, or self-care. So you can use this as a smoke-free and soot-free alternative to things like candles, incense, and smudge sticks. I also want to inform everyone that a portion of every single SESH spray or drops that we sell is donated to an organization called Water First. And this is a nonprofit organization that helps supply remote indigenous communities with fresh drinking water. So there are other benefits that go far beyond the individual using SESH that benefit other people every time they use our product.